Welcome, everybody, to RP Live. Tonight's guest is Randall Wray, who everybody's aware of. We had more people register for tonight than ever before to any of our events. So I told Randy he's a rock star. But it's also thanks to our great schedulers. People have been posting it like crazy. Everybody's been really good at promoting the event. So my name's Virginia. I'm with Real Progressives, and I'm just going to tell you about the book club that we will be doing as a follow-up to this. We'll be doing a book club about Randy's book. It's going to be 3 sessions starting on Monday, January 30th, then February 6th and February 13th, a couple of chapters for each of those. We will have a guest expert at each one. Eric Tymoigne is doing chapters 1 and 2. Yeva Narcissian is doing chapters 3, 4, and 5. And then Randy will be back for chapters 6 and 7. The reason we have the experts coming is to help us answer your questions, help us clear up parts that are difficult to understand. I'm hoping that someone will step up and volunteer to do short summaries on each of the chapters that we're covering. That would be great because this is your book club too. It should belong to all of us. So that would be really good. So tonight, our host is a dear friend of Real Progressives, Kami John, and who's hosted past book clubs for us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Kami John. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Mom Red. And good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us. We have a pretty cool little event planned tonight. Before I introduce our guest, I wanted to say, make sure you hop over to the RP website. It's realprogressives.org. It is a treasure trove of resources and content. And you can find the flagship podcast, Macro and Cheese. There's over 200 episodes now, man. Really awesome resource. Also, Steve Grumbine, who is the big cheese here at Real Progressives. He does a live stream on the YouTube channel Monday, Wednesday, and Friday called The Rogue Scholar. That's really good.
John, I forgot the most important thing. People who attend book club can also get a free copy of the book. Real Progressive did a bulk order. As a nonprofit, we get a decent discount. We have a limited amount, so it's going to be first come, first serve. If you already have the book or if you're willing to buy it yourself to let other people have the free copies, then please do. When you register for the book club, there'll be a little question where you say, do you want a copy of the book or not? If you do, you have to put your mailing address in there. There'll be a thing asking for your address. It's not mandatory, but it is if you want a book. So be sure that we know how to send it to you.
Yeah. And again, feel free to throw a little donation to the Real Progressives Patreon account, as a, thanks for a free book. Cause man, it is an awesome book and totally worth it. So I'll tell you what, without further ado, let's introduce our guest. He is one of my favorites and just one of the most just brilliant economic mind, Dr. L. Randall Wray. He's a professor of economics at Bard College and senior scholar at the Levy Economics Institute. He's written a lot of books and primers, too many to list, but a couple of my favorites are the groundbreaking textbook Macroeconomics, which he co-authored with Martin Watts and our friend Bill Mitchell. Why Minsky Matters is a good one, and probably my favorite so far up till this new one, The Rise and Fall of Money Manager Capitalism, that he co-wrote with Eric Tymoigne. Really good stuff. He's been putting out a lot of great content. So, ladies, gentlemen, comrades, Dr. L. Randall Wray, the floor is yours, sir.
Okay. Thank you. I will put up a PowerPoint that is summarizing the main ideas in this book, but what I'm going to be showing are the cartoons that will be coming out in an illustrated guide to modern money theory. And a former Levy economics student, Heske, has provided all of the illustrations. She's not only a very good economist, as you will see, she's a great artist. And so I'm going to keep this simple and try to save time for Q&A at the end. And then, as you know, there will be 3 more seminars on the book itself. Back in 1997, when I was finishing up Understanding Modern Money, which was the first academic type book on modern money theory, Warren Mosler had published a pamphlet, Soft Currency Economics. So I was preparing this book and I had the manuscript done, and I sent it off to Robert Heilbroner, who those of you who studied economics in college have come across, because he's probably the most prolific author of economics who ever lived. And I asked him if he would write a short blurb for the book. I had some connections with him, but we did not really know each other. And out of the blue, I got a phone call. This is back in the old days when your phone hung on the wall. And he said, "You've asked me to write a blurb for your book. And your book is about money. This is something I cannot do. Your book is going to scare the hell out of everybody." So anyway, I published the book without his blurb, and it turned out he was right. Money is a scary topic, and we've been scaring people for about 25 years. We've been trying to make it less and less scary, and I'm hoping that this book that we're talking about today, but also especially the illustrated guide, will make it less scary. So I'm going to keep it simple, and I hope not too scary. Let's begin the way that you usually do in an economics course, but it also makes sense. When we talk about what is money, generally you begin with the functions. What can you do with money? Well, you can spend it. We call that medium of exchange in our economics classes. You can pay bills with it. We call that means of payment. And I've highlighted here, including your tax bill, because that is something that is very important for MMT. Probably most of you know the punchline on that, which we will get to. You can save it, but you got to be careful. If you save too much, take it too far, then you're a Scrooge, which is not a good thing to be. And finally, you can redeem it. This is another very important point that I'm going to be talking about as we move through this. Okay, but that doesn't really tell us what money is. It tells us what money does, not really what it is. It's sort of like saying a human is something that sits on the couch and munches potato chips while they watch TV. Doesn't really tell us what a human is. If you look at every form of money, it is always an IOU. The currency, whether it's paper money or coins, is the IOU of Uncle Sam. Technically, it could be the Fed or it could be the Treasury, but it's a government IOU. When you write a check to your landlord, that is your promise to pay, which is an IOU. Now, your bank backs you up. They endorse the check, and they are going to make the payment for you, but it is your IOU. People say they've made a big deal about this, that, in the future, we're going to have electronic money. Well, the truth is almost all of our money already is electronic. Almost all transactions are electronic today. We may use currency very occasionally, unless we happen to be in one of the illegal trades. And sometimes we write checks. Younger people probably never write checks, don't even know what they are. And so the payments really are electronic already for the most part. We can ask, where did money come from? What are the origins of money? John Maynard Keynes, who is, I think, the greatest economist, at least in the non-Marxist tradition. Okay, so I will have that caveat. He said, well, the origins are lost in the mists of time. And he goes on to say it was at least 4,000 years ago that money was invented, and most likely in Babylonia. David Graeber has a great book on the history of debt. And we probably can push that back a bit further than what Keynes thought. We have a lot more evidence now. But probably it was Babylonia. Maybe it was more like 6,000 years ago. And it was created by accountants who were keeping records on clay Shubati tablets. And this is long before there were coins, long before paper money. In fact, long before there was currency. Money first existed as records kept on clay that didn't really change hands. It was a form of record keeping, and purchases were mostly in the form of credit that then would be eventually settled. So we like to think that we're much more advanced than the Babylonians. We have credit and debt now. But actually, that's probably the way that money began. And it's been very common for the past 6,000 years to buy things on credit. If you're buying stuff on credit, somebody's got to keep track. So we got to keep records of those debts and credits. So debts are denominated in a money of account. Now, we are used to having measuring units, and these are probably as old as humans. We have measurements for volume, cups, milliliters. We have measurements for weight, pounds, kilograms. And we have measurements for distance, length, inches, feet, centimeters, and so on. And then we keep a record of those measurements. Now, money was a conceptual leap. It's pretty easy for a human to come up with, the notion of an inch. I got an inch right here. I can measure things with this. I measure things that have the characteristic of length, or I measure things that have the characteristic of weight. But money is a strange measuring unit because we can measure things that have no obvious physical characteristic in common whatsoever. That was the leap that probably was made by Mesopotamians, okay? We can compare things that have nothing obvious in common using this measuring unit, money. And so I show here the alewife in Babylonian times who makes the beer and sells the beer. And when you drink a few beers, she records your debt on slate, chalk on slate behind the bar. And then once a year, or sometimes it could go a couple of years, you would settle your debts that are denominated in mina, which is the money of account, by delivering barley, which she needs because she's going to make more beer. Okay, so this is what I meant by most transactions took the form of credits and debits. So what is money? Money is an IOU denominated in the money of account. Who can create money? My professor, Hyman Minsky, used to always say, anyone can create money. All you have to do is write, I owe you $5. You have created money. The problem is to get it accepted. You have to have somebody willing to accept your IOU denominated in the money of account. When I talked about Babylonia, they used the clay Shubati tablets. There's a picture here of those. In Europe, records were kept mostly on tally sticks, as far back as we know. The records of money and indebtedness was recorded on sticks, Hazelwood tally sticks. We still use the word tally for tallying up your debts. And what they would do is notch across the stick and then split it in two so that you had a stock and a stub. So you have a record that can be matched to make sure you have not counterfeited by putting more notches on the stick. And then finally, the thicker notches were called scores, which we still use today as in a baseball score, which I'll come back to. We also have the term raise a tally when the king wants to spend, which I'll come back to too. Okay. There is a very a universal principle of debt, and that is that it must be redeemed. And so let me give, this is actually Eric Tymoigne's example that I borrowed and that Heskey has drawn up. Joe's pizza joint. So he starts up a pizza joint and he wants to drum up some business. So he passes free pizza coupons around the neighborhood. That pizza coupon is Joe's debt. If you get one of these pizza coupons, it is your asset. Okay. Now, what does Joe owe you? This is not a money debt, it's a pizza debt. He owes you a pizza. You bring the coupon in, Joe cooks the pizza, and you present your coupon. You have redeemed the coupon, and Joe has redeemed his debt. There's a simultaneous redemption. Both parties are redeemed. Joe no longer owes you a pizza, and you no longer have Joe's debt. Now, what does Joe do with the pizza coupon? Well, he tosses it in the pizza oven because for him, it's just a piece of paper. It used to be his debt, but now it's been redeemed. He no longer owes a pizza, and so he's just going to burn that coupon. Let me give you another example. This comes from Farley Grubb, who's one of the top experts on colonial American money. And what he found is if you look at the 13 colonies, all of them issued paper money. Very unusual. This was the first example of paper money issue in the West. Chinese had paper money for hundreds of years before, but in the West, we did not have that. The American colonies could not issue coins. They had to use British coins. They were prohibited from issuing their own coins, and they were always short of coins to fund the American colonial expenses. And so they hit on the idea of paper money because it was sort of a loophole in the law. There was no law that said you can't create paper money because no one had thought of doing that before. So each legislature, so let's just take the example of Virginia, would authorize the printing and issuing of, say, 10,000 pounds of Virginia notes. And at the same time, they would impose a new tax that was expected to raise 10,000 pounds over the next several years. They would then spend those paper notes into existence. You would sell your mule and cart to the colonial government and receive back paper money. Now, why on earth would you trade your mule, which has obvious value, for a piece of paper that says 50 shillings? And the answer is, well, you had to pay the tax. Once you pay the tax, it returns to the colonial government. That is redemption. There's a simultaneous redemption, just like with Joe's pizza coupon. You no longer owe a tax debt, and the government no longer owes you in the form of the paper promise. Okay? What does the government do with the paper money? Just like Joe, they burn it. And this is fact. So the colonial governments kept very careful records of all the taxes received. They wanted to demonstrate that all of those paper notes were burned. They were taken out of circulation and burned when the taxes were paid. So what comes first logically? Government spending or taxing? Obviously, if the government had not spent the notes, nobody could pay the tax because they didn't have the notes with which they could pay the tax. So the spending has to come first. Does the government spend the tax revenue? No, the government burns the tax revenue, which also makes it very clear spending comes first. So our shorthand way of describing modern money theory is to say, it's the theory that taxes drive the demand for money. TDM, taxes drive money. My professor used to always say in class, the need to pay taxes means that people work hard to get that in which taxes are paid. We all accept Uncle Sam's currency because we have to pay taxes. Now, I know someone can object, well, I never have to pay taxes because I have no income, so I don't have to receive it. But the point is that as long as enough people have to pay taxes, there will be a demand for the government's currency because you know that there are other people who need to pay taxes. Now, modern governments do not spend the way that Joe spends his pizza coupons or the way the colonial government printed up paper money and spent. We stopped doing that in the United States in 1913. We created a central bank, the Fed. And we also, for most of our payments, use private banks. So I had the example of you paying your landlord by writing a check. So what we have today is 2 degrees of separation between the government and the taxpayer. So it's become much less obvious the way that things work. Our modern governments make all their payments through their central bank. In our case, it's called the Fed. So our Treasury makes all payments through the Fed. And then the Fed uses private banks to make the payments to, let's say, the contractors who deliver services to the government, or to the government employees, or to the recipients of Social Security payments. Those are made by private banks. So all government spending goes through the central bank and then through private banks before it gets to you. The way that it works is that the central bank will credit your bank's reserves when you receive, let's say, one of those COVID relief checks. The central bank will credit your bank's reserves and your bank will credit your deposit account. That's how all modern government spending occurs. When you pay taxes, you don't deliver a wheelbarrow full of currency to the IRS. Instead, you write a check on your bank or you have a direct payment made, a deduction from your bank account, and then your bank's reserves are debited by the Fed. That's how taxes are paid. So today, all spending runs through central banks and then through private banks. And it all takes the form, well, increasingly takes the form of keystrokes. The government, federal government, was supposed to stop issuing checks, I believe, in the 1990s, but it still hasn't completely gotten around to that. So there still are some checks that are circulating, but increasingly the payments are electronic. So remember I said to my professor, Hyman Minsky, you say anyone can create money. Well, maybe we don't want to call every kind of IOU money. So this is sort of a Venn diagram that shows that, the broadest category we have is IOUs, and that could include pizza IOUs or a cup of sugar IOUs. A narrower category is the IOU that is actually written in terms of money. So IOU $5 would be a money denominated IOU, but we might not want to call your $5 IOU money. We might want to keep it more narrow than that and define it as the economist's term M1, which is cash plus checkable deposits. And we might want to go broader than that for some questions. But the point is that only some monetary IOUs probably we would want to qualify as money. Banks create much of our money. The vast majority of our money is created by banks. And for example, if you set up a bakery and you need to hire some employees to produce the bread, you go to the bank and you take out a loan. The bank creates a deposit in the name of your bakery, and you are able to meet the payroll by drawing down your bank account. And then the employees deposit their paychecks in some commercial bank. So the payments go through the private banking system. And then, sort of at the top of this pyramid of the payment system, we have the Fed again, which has a second role. In addition to making all the payments for the government, it has the responsibility for clearing checks between banks. And the reason why we do that is to ensure that a $1 check from one bank, let's say Citi, is always worth the same as a $100 check from Chase. Believe it or not, this was not true in the United States until 1913 when we created the Fed. So the Fed has this second role, which is to make sure that all the private checks clear. Now, where does the money come from? I referred earlier to score and to score keeping. We can use the baseball analogy to gain an understanding of where money comes from. So Heskey didn't know a lot about baseball. So this would be a very unusual baseball game with a score of 21-14. But let's say the home team hits another home run. Now, where is the scorekeeper going to find another run in order to increase the home team score to 15 runs? In the old days, they would have cards and they would change out the 4 and put a 5 up there. Today, it's all keystrokes. Can the scorekeeper ever run out of runs? And the answer is obviously not. You can run out of innings in baseball. You can run out of time in football. But you cannot run out of runs. It's keystrokes. And just as this is the scorekeeper for a baseball game, banks and central banks are the scorekeepers in the monetary game, and they cannot run out. Occasionally, even Fed officials will admit this. Up in the upper left corner is Beardsley Rummel. He was a New Dealer. He's the father of tax withholding, and he also was the chairman of the New York Fed. And after the World War II, when government spending reached 50% of GDP, the budget deficit reached 25% of GDP, and the government debt ratio reached 100% of GDP. These were all fantastic numbers for that time period. He went around the country and he gave a speech and he said, taxes for revenue purposes are obsolete. We don't need no stinking taxes to spend. The war has taught the government and the war has taught the people that taxes might be important for other purposes, but they are not needed to finance government spending. Okay. Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the Fed, was brought in by Paul Ryan to testify. And Ryan thought that he had a coup. He was going to have Greenspan come in. He's going to ask him, is Social Security going to go bankrupt? He was surprised. And you can watch the video because it's hilarious. He didn't get the answer he wanted. Greenspan said, no, of course not. So the government is the issuer of the currency. It can always print more money and pay all of Social Security's debts. Okay. Or more recently, Ben Bernanke. After the global financial crisis, Congress discovered that the Fed had spent and lent $29 trillion to bail out Wall Street. That's 12 zeros, okay? And they wanted to know, they were furious. And they asked him, where did the Fed get all that money to spend? Was it taxpayer money? And Bernanke honestly said, no, of course not. It was keystrokes. Now, he was talking about the Fed bailout, but the Fed, remember, is the government's bank. All spending by the federal government runs through the Fed. The Fed makes the payments for the Treasury. So you cannot run out. And of course, now it's obvious because we just had the COVID pandemic. We had COVID relief that was $9 trillion allocated for spending with no pay-fors and no problem making the payments. Okay, what about the debt? We're going to come up against the debt limit again, and we've seen what went on in Congress, and we know it's going to be a big deal this time around. We have a debt clock, used to be in Times Square, they moved it. But anyway, Paul Samuelson, who's probably the most famous American economist, was asked in an interview about, all this worry about deficits and debt and so on. And he said, look, this is like one of those fairy tales we tell our children, about the big bad wolf in the forest so that they won't wander around at night in the dark out in the forest, okay? It's just a story we tell the politicians and the voters to scare them. Now, he thought that was a good thing, that we're scaring them so they will behave themselves, all right? But he understood it's nothing but a fairy tale. There's nothing to be worried about here. What is government debt? MMT turns it around. This is not what we owe, okay? It's not that we will ever have to be called on to repay the government's debt. What the government's debt is, a government owes us. It is our financial wealth. The government's debt is our net financial wealth. Now, of course, you might hold other people's debt, but in the private sector, for every debt, there is an asset. So they cancel one another out. The creditor owns your debt. Those cancel to zero. The only thing that's left once we net out all the private sector debt is government debt. So that about $32 trillion of federal government debt right now is our net financial wealth. What about the deficit? Well, the story is sort of similar. The deficit is the amount by which the government's spending exceeds its tax revenue in any given year. This graph here is called the sectoral balance graph. It shows the government's balance, which is in red, and you notice that it's virtually always below zero, well below zero. That is showing the government's spending is greater than taxes, which is what we call a budget deficit. That is absolutely normal. Sorry that the dates are messed up on the graph, but this starts in 1960, but this would be true as far back as we go. The government usually runs a deficit since the Great Depression. The blue represents the non-government sector's balance. That is everybody who is not Uncle Sam. So it includes U.S. households, U.S. firms, but also foreigners. They have a surplus. It's above zero. Another word for surplus, the more common word, is saving. That is our saving. And you notice it's a mirror image, which it has to be, because the government's deficit by identity is equal to our surplus. And you notice at the very end of the graph there, when the COVID hit and the relief spending took place, plus tax revenue plummeted because of the state of the economy, the deficit grew tremendously. And that is exactly equal to the growth of our savings. So instead of worrying about the deficit, we should be thankful that the government came to the rescue and allowed us to increase our savings, which helped to calm things down and led to the fastest recovery from the deepest recession we have ever had. Those of you who are old enough will remember this. Between 1997 and 1999, the federal government actually ran a surplus. That was shown in the graph there too. And President Clinton went on television in 1999 talking about the 2000 budget. And you can watch this video too. It also is hilarious because he was so proud. that he'd been running a surplus and finally reducing the government's debt. And he brings out a paintbrush, and you can tell he's continued the line. So we were right here. He continues the line with the projection that was made by his Council of Economic Advisors that not only would we continue to run a budget surplus for the next 15 years, we were going to retire all the government debt and even go below zero, which means that we would owe the government. So not only would Clinton plan to take away all of our net financial wealth, he was going to leave us owing the government at the end of the 15-year period. Well, at the time we said, well, this ain't going to happen because we're going to dive bomb into a recession that will eliminate the budget surplus. And this would cripple the economy. And furthermore, it's not a good idea anyway. Why would we want to eliminate all of our net financial assets? Well, it turned out he was wrong and we were right. First, we had the dot-com bubble collapse, and then we had the global financial crisis. We've been in deficit ever since. We almost went into a surplus before COVID hit, and we almost certainly would have had a recession even without COVID. Okay, when the global financial crisis hit, Obama got a relief package, but it was only $400 billion for 2 years. So the total was $800 billion. Why 800? Because $1 trillion was too scary. He said, I know we need more money. I know the government should spend more, do more to get us out, because it took us 1 decade to get out of the global financial crisis, but we're out of money. Well, obviously that is false. We saw the Fed officials saying you cannot run out of money. Recently, I think this was summer of 2021, Representative Yarmuth, who was the head of the House Budget Committee, in other words, responsible for spending all of the money, had studied MMT. He read Stephanie Kelton's book. He had me come testify before his committee. He had Stephanie testify. He completely understood modern money theory. And he gave this just remarkable interview for the first time ever. A congressional representative with this kind of position coming out and saying, telling the truth. He said, we issue our own currency and we can spend enough to meet the needs of the American people. Historically, what we've always done is said, what can we afford to do? And that's not the right question. The right question is, what do the American people need us to do? And once you answer that, then the only question is, do you have the resources you need? And by resources, he didn't need money, obviously. What he meant was, do you have the labor and do you have the natural resources and the plant and equipment that you need to accomplish what the American people need us to do? And if you've got that, then you can do it. So anyway, I'm nearing the end. Stephanie came up with this aviary classification. Don't listen to the deficit doves who say, oh, it's okay to run a deficit when you're in the depths of a recession, but then you got to balance the budget and try to run a surplus to offset it. Don't listen to the hawks who say you always have to balance your budget. Listen to the deficit owls who understand what they're talking about. Deficit is nothing to fear. The government's red ink is our black ink. Furthermore, we've had 50 years of neoliberalism. That it really started with Nixon, but let's give Reagan the credit he deserves, who argued that the government is the problem and we need to get the government off our back. So we're downsizing the government. We are starving the beast with tax cuts for the rich and then using the excuse that we can't afford social spending so that we can cut social spending. We need to reverse that. What we need to do is understand what Yarmuth was saying and to understand we do have the resources that we need. We do have the know-how to tackle the tremendous existential challenges that we face, beginning with the pandemic, but then the climate catastrophe, poverty, homelessness, inequality, racism, sexism, and rising sea levels and refugees. We have the resources, we have the know-how, we have the money. All we need to do is quicken the will of our political class. So let me stop there.
All right. Excellent. Steve Cobb had a couple questions.
Good. Okay. I'm aware of Article 1, Section 8 that makes the U.S. government the exclusive issuer of the currency. I'm wondering what I say to an MMT critic who might say that a bank is creating currency when it establishes a loan for a creditworthy customer.
Yeah. Well, that's not true. The loan will take the form of a demand deposit, which is a liability of the bank. It's not a liability of the U.S. government. Now, we do back up bank money, demand deposits, in two ways. One is FDIC. Okay, now that obviously that wasn't always true. We did that in the New Deal in order to stop bank runs, because bank runs will destroy your banking system. Okay. Even if they begin as rational behavior, it very quickly becomes irrational behavior, because banks do not store a whole bunch of cash in their vaults. So we have insured their deposits. So I'm perfectly happy to say that a demand deposit is as default proof as cash. That is true, because FDIC guarantees it. You cannot lose, up to the deposit limit. Uncle Sam will pay you off. And the second thing is that we created the Fed earlier, that's 1913, in order to make sure that bank deposits clear at par, which is what I was saying when I said that a city check for $100 will always clear against a Chase check at 100. And that had not been true. Both of these things are fairly common in the developed capitalist countries, to have deposit insurance and also to have the central bank clearing at par and acting as a lender of last resort when necessary in order to keep the payment system stable and enabling the checks to clear. So it might sound like a quibble. They are as good as cash, but they are not currency. And there's no violation of the Constitution in allowing banks to issue deposits. There is another thing people say is that the central bank issuing our paper money is a violation of the Constitution, because it says only Congress can do that. But Congress created the Fed. The Fed was created in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So that also is perfectly consistent with the Constitution.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Up next, we have Don Wilford.
Okay. So I've got a follow-on question, a couple, but first is, what's your view of bank-created money? You've just given us that, but isn't it then obvious that a key aspect of monetary policy should be to control how much money banks are allowed to create? My second question relates to flooding the system with reserves. Isn't there a problem with having too many reserves in the system? And the third relates to converting reserves to bonds. Yeah, if bonds are a form of saving, let's take an extreme example. If there's 50 GDP years of savings out there, doesn't it reduce the government's capacity to provision itself because there's so much outstanding unpaid tax base in the economy? And anyway, doesn't it mean that the government is underwriting inequality because most of that debt is held by the 0.1%?
Yeah.
End of questions.
Okay. Remember, anyone can create money. The problem is to get it accepted. Now, we have an economic system that is a monetary system. So a huge proportion of our provisioning takes place within the monetary system. And most previous human societies, even those that used money, didn't base their economic system on money, but we do. And we have allowed banks to have some special privileges that I just went through. Government stands behind their liabilities. Anyone can create money, but government doesn't stand behind you. Government stands behind Bank of America. And they play the role of running most of our monetary system. Is that a good idea? Well, it has worked tolerably well, with punctuated by severe financial crises. If you go back to the 19th century, we had a depression every generation. And they usually start because of a financial crisis. And it's usually because of stuff the banks did. Okay. They became much less common after the New Deal. We didn't have any financial crises actually till 1966, and that was a very small one. We had another in 1970, another pretty small one. We resolved them pretty easily. Over time, the crises have gotten much more severe, much harder to resolve. Okay, so definitely things have changed. The system has gotten much riskier. And so the question of whether, we ought to be doing something about this, that we ought to be regulating and carefully watching what the financial system is doing, I think is the correct conclusion. The system we've got isn't working nearly as well as the system we had for the first 30, 40 years after the Great Depression. And that is because our Fed, our Treasury, our FDIC, and our OCC, those are the main regulators, plus every state has regulators of banks too, are not doing their job. So I think the answer is yes, we should increase supervision and regulation of their behavior. Trying to control the money supply, which was Milton Friedman and the monetarist idea, is not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is to actually regulate the activities they engage in and to eliminate the risky stuff. Don't let them do the risky stuff. Go ahead and let them make commercial loans to the baker who wants to open a bakery and needs to pay workers and has a business plan. Let them do that. But don't let them create these derivatives that allow them to bet that homeowners will lose their homes. Serves no useful social purpose. And that is what caused the global financial crisis. And the biggest banks have returned to the same sorts of things they were doing in the early 2000s. They're doing them again. And with the Fed raising interest rates, we might well have another crisis, something like that. Okay, so anyway, that's an alternative to focusing on the money supply measured as M1 or something like that, and instead focusing on making sure banks serve some useful public purpose. If they don't let them do it. Second, flooding with reserves. The Fed engaged in quantitative easing. Many other major central banks did this. It had almost no impact. It just proved that they don't really understand what they're doing. We always argued they shouldn't have done it. Did it have any hugely negative impacts? No, not really. Did it have any positive impacts? No, not really. All it did was exchange treasury bonds that were held by banks, which is a treasury debt to banks that pays interest, to reserves, which is a Fed central bank debt to banks that pays very low interest. Why would that be beneficial? It wasn't, okay? But it didn't really have any negative impacts. Now, we have had a huge increase in inequality. The recovery from the global financial crisis, all of the recovery, all the benefits of recovery went to the very top 10%. If you look at the pandemic, the benefits of the recovery of the pandemic overwhelmingly went to the top, increased the number of billionaires. Okay, so we have a problem, a tremendous problem of inequality in the United States. And we need to tackle that directly. It's not really related to the flooding the system with reserves through quantitative easing. It's possible that the zero interest rate policy played some role in it, though, making it very cheap for high income people to borrow and then purchase assets. I better stop because we probably want a few more questions.
Yeah, and that's a hell of an argument for public banks. But anywho, we'll get on to our next guy, Charles Silva.
Cool. So in MMT, a lot of times we usually just say the government has to spend before it taxes. But like sometimes when you're walking through the actual process, like the operations with somebody, you run into a problem because like under current law, we have to have a positive Treasury general account balance, and that gets quote unquote filled up through taxes and securities sales. But then like obviously you have to point out that the reserves used to purchase the securities come from the Fed in the first place, and MMT consolidates the Fed with the Treasury. So you know, the government is essentially financing itself. But I'm wondering, like, in your opinion, do you think it's, at least under current operations, more accurate to say the government has to lend or do advances or pay interest on reserves before it can spend and then issue securities? Or do you think that the consolidation of the Treasury and the Fed makes it like just okay to say, no, we just spend first and then to end tax later?
So the Fed and Treasury over the past 100 years had developed the procedures to make sure that basically Treasury checks will never bounce due to insufficient funds. So look at it this way. Every single day of the year, the Treasury is making billions of dollars of payments. And they're bunched around the first of the month, but there's payment. You don't really know when people are going to deposit their check and so on. And so it's spread out over the year, but with some bunches. Tax revenue comes in quarterly, and then around, April 15, when all of us who operate the way I do, you wait until April 15th, right? And then you pay your tax. And so the daily mismatch is huge. It's always going to be huge. Even if at the end of the year you calculate it and wow, taxes exactly equaled government spending. Okay. But on any given day, that probably never happens. And the gaps are huge. So they had to come up with procedures to make sure that the Treasury's account at the Fed always has the funds in, or they can quickly get them in. Okay. And so they create special depositories with tax and loan accounts. They they designate certain banks to be special who can buy treasuries even if they don't have reserves. We have dealer banks that always must place bids, and they have to be reasonable bids or they lose their status. So we've come up with a whole array of procedures to make sure that the prohibitions that require the Treasury actually has to have a positive account in order for the checks to clear, and that the Fed cannot buy bonds directly from the Treasury, because that would be Fed lending to the Treasury, so that the checks never bounce, the payment system works very smoothly, and the Fed can always hit its interest rate targets, which used to be a huge problem when the Fed did not pay interest on reserves. So all of these special procedures are developed to make sure the system moves smoothly. And if we do what people complain about, MMT does consolidation of the Fed and Treasury and treats that as if it's the government. Well, first, there's a pretty good reason to do it, because the Federal Reserve is a part of government. It's a creature of Congress, created by Congress, and will do anything that Congress tells it to do, including, hey, go ahead and allow overdrafts if Congress told it to do that. But also because at the end of the day, the balance sheets look exactly the same, whether you have these prohibitions or don't. And the reason that they look exactly the same is because there is no other way for the government to spend other than crediting bank reserves. So in the end, no matter what those operations are behind the scene, when the Treasury spends, reserves go up. When you pay your taxes, reserves go down. That has to happen. Okay. Anyway, read more of Eric Tymoigne and Scott Fulwiler's work on this. And it's also in Understanding Modern Money and in Modern Money Primer. There's not going to be a lot of that because I'm trying to stay out of the technical detail in the new book.
All right. I just have to change my notes. I was told the Fed was a creature of Jekyll Isle. It is a creature of Congress. Got it.
Okay.
All right. Matthew Pivovitz, a good comrade. You are up, sir.
Hey guys. Yeah, so just a quick question, and I think you kind of already touched on the answer from the previous question. So I was going to ask, MMT basically tells us that spending comes first, and all new spending is new dollars, which adds to the net wealth of the private economy. You mentioned, though, that's more of a simplified process. I was looking to see if you could explain a little bit more about the detailed process, that the non-simplified version, I suppose. But I think, again, you may have covered that with some of those other depositories and other actions going back and forth.
Okay, well, so previous to 1913, when the Fed was created, if you have to pay your taxes in currency, as in the colonies, it's pretty clear the government has to spend those first. When we look at the way things work today, in order for you to pay taxes, you have to have income, okay, so that you can accumulate deposits in your bank so that you can write the check. And you have to, and your bank has to have reserves. So how do the reserves get there? They get there from government spending. That's one way. They can also get there from the Fed purchasing bonds through an open market purchase, or the Fed lending reserves. So those are the three ways that banks can get reserves. So you could argue that the government doesn't have to spend first. The central bank could lend reserves, or it could purchase government bonds, which is a kind of spending, but economists don't include that as spending. That's an asset purchase, not spending for the GDP component. So lending by the Fed and asset purchases by the Fed will also do the job. So that is true. However, For those who studied macro, spending always equals income at the aggregate level. Okay. And this is by accounting identity. So our measure of spending is GDP, used to be GNP, and our measure of income is national income. Those two have to be equal at the aggregate level for the simple reason that if someone spends, someone had to receive income. Must be true. The question then is, which comes first? From the individual household level, it looks like, well, income comes first. Okay, now it's true I could borrow, but for the most part, I need the income flow before I spend. So it looks like income leads to spending. But that can't be true at the aggregate level. The reason is because as a society, we can always decide to spend more. We can't decide to have more income. But if we do decide to spend more, we will have more income. Okay? And when you get a little bit further into macro, you learn the injection leakages approach, which is that it is injections of spending into the economy that can increase the leakages out of the economy. And it derives from this macro spending equals income. We take consumption out of both, and we get down to this. Well, what are the injections into the economy? Investment, government spending, and exports. What are the leakages? Saving, taxes, and imports. And the injections logically have to come before the leakages. Because again, we can decide to spend more. We can't decide to have more income, which will allow us to have more leakages. We could save more, we could pay more taxes, we could buy more imports if our income was higher. So logically, the spending comes first. And this is recognized by everybody who studies macro for the case of investment. But the same has to be true for government. So this is looking at it from the macro perspective, and regardless of the procedures that are followed that are dictated in the Federal Reserve Act, logically, spending comes before income. Injections come before leakages. Government spending comes before tax payments. It creates the income that can be used to pay taxes.
All right, indeed. Virginia, are you ready?
Yeah, sure. This is a question from an anonymous attendee, but they asked us to read the question. I got into a debate on Facebook with someone saying the U.S. can default on its debt. They shared an article from The Balance by Kimberly Amadeo saying two ways it could happen. One, if we didn't raise or suspend the national debt ceiling, and two, by not paying interest on T-notes, bills, and bonds. I countered, our federal government can create the money it spends, and I shared the Alan Greenspan, Paul Ryan video. They started talking about bond rates and such. Now, I'm watching your slide that almost answers, but could it happen, the U.S. defaulting as a bad Federal Reserve or political decision? Thank you for your response.
Okay. Can't conceive that the Fed could do it because the Fed is a creature of Congress and the chairman would be called in. Can Congress do it? The answer is yes. What MMT says, and I think also what all of those Fed officials would have said is the United States federal government cannot be forced into default. Okay. Can Congress choose to default? Yes, it can. Is it likely to do that? I think I would still say unlikely, even given what just happened. Okay. Where the crazies have taken over. the Republican Congress, House. That side of the House, at least, has been taken over by truly crazy people who are going to refuse to raise the debt limit. I mean, that's their plan. Will they be able to pull it off? I don't know. If you cannot raise the debt limit, then, you know, we've been there before, and what has happened is the Treasury tries to delay payments, furlough workers, and so on. But eventually, the Congress may prevent the Treasury from making interest payments. But this is a voluntary default. It's a political gimmick that is at least theoretically possible. Could bondholders force us to default? The answer to that is clearly no. They cannot force us to, because we can always make those payments, as Greenspan was saying. Okay, so that's the distinction. Do you mean voluntary default? No. Sorry, we could. Involuntary default? No. We can't be forced involuntarily to do it.
All right. Our next question is from a friend of the organization, Wesley Wiles, and I'm going to read it for him. There's an insight that MMT offers you've pointed out many times, but I've never found anywhere else. That is that savings cannot be transferred through time in the form of an income, financial, at the macroeconomic state level, and really by more spending now on building up real resources and infrastructure can transfer a form savings at that level. Can you further explain this to us?
Yeah, well, so it goes back to what I was saying. Over any given period of time, spending determines income. Okay. And so people are worried about Social Security. And until I think it's 1983, the Greenspan Commission. So it's kind of ironic. It was Greenspan who headed this commission. We realize we're an aging society. The ratio of people collecting Social Security will rise relative to the number of people who will be working and paying Social Security taxes. And they were worried that at some point, the revenue wouldn't be sufficient to make the payments. So they are thinking taxes pay for Social Security. And Roosevelt sort of set it up this way on purpose because he didn't want anyone to say, well, it's welfare spending. No, it's not welfare spending because you're all paying taxes. So it's sort of like a pension fund. And we're going to use the taxes that are paid in order to pay the Social Security pensions. Well, that worked okay when you had very few retirees and lots of workers. It doesn't work so well in 2050 when you have a lot of retirees relative to workers. And so they started worrying about it. So what Greenspan proposed was, let's collect a lot more in taxes than we need to make the payments today. And we will accumulate savings that we will be able to use in 2050. Actually, it's like 2035, I think is the number, the year they're using. We'll use our savings to supplement the tax revenue to make the payments. Well, the savings are in the form of U.S. Treasuries. So they have to be turned back to the U.S. Treasury that is going to have to pay Social Security. And so the question is, what good did it do? None. It does no good at all. If you really believe you need taxes to pay for the Social Security payments in 2035 or 2050, the Treasury is still going to have to come up with the money. Where are they going to get it? Well, really, it's keystrokes. It's not going to come from tax payments anyway. So the building up of the trust fund did not help us prepare for the retiring baby boom at all. What the baby boom will need is not money. what they need is the real resources. I'm one of them. You know, they need the old folks' homes. Or I used to always joke, they need the Winnebagos. And if what Greenspan plans to do is to buy the Winnebagos in 1983 and bury them and dig them back up for the retirees in 2035, okay, it makes some kind of sense. Although it's probably not a good idea because they're going to rust, and who knows if they're really going to want Winnebagos. But saving doesn't help us at all do that. In fact, it makes things worse. And the reason that it makes things worse is taxing more than you spend, or at the individual level, reducing your consumption in order to save more just reduces income in 1983. Okay? It depresses your economy. And what that means is you're probably going to grow more slowly, which means you're going to increase productive capacity more slowly. You will actually be less prepared in 2035 to take care of the retirees because you won't have built all the plant and equipment you might have built if the economy operated at a faster growth pace. So if anything, trying to save for the future just depresses your economy now and leaves you less prepared. What we should have been doing is not increasing saving, not increasing the payroll tax to accumulated trust fund. We should have started building old folks' homes. Okay, now we don't have enough. So the answer was spend more, not spend less or raise taxes.
Yes, indeed. All right. Our next question is from James, and he was going to have us read it for him. What is the MMT analysis of the current inflation spike?
Okay. Well, if you go to the Levy website, you can just Google levy.org. You'll find a paper by Yeva Narcissian, who's going to be one of the discussion leaders that go through what has caused the high inflation. It mostly is on the supply side. So, I mean, this is so obvious that people could not go to work because it wasn't safe. So businesses were shut down. Supply chains were disrupted. Everything you buy at Walmart is made in China, and China chose zero COVID policy. And I'm not criticizing, I'm just stating a fact. They did. And that meant that the production of lots of the things we normally would buy, it was reduced. The shipping was dominated, I think, by 3 shipping firms, and they could price gouge and did. So shipping costs increased tremendously. We had a fortuitous or not so fortuitous, depending on which side you're on, shutting down of some oil refineries, so that when the economy started reopening and people started driving again, there wasn't enough petroleum being refined, so they could gouge oil prices and gasoline prices. President Biden's has a committee researching the rise of the markup, which is, firms set their price as a markup over their costs. That markup has tripled since 1980, and all of the disruptions allowed them to greatly increase their markup. So they already had been raising them over time, but that was somewhat attenuated by all of the competition from low-wage labor in Asia, which again got disrupted because of COVID and the shipping and all of that. Now they were free to really boost the markups, and they did. And they proudly told their boards when they talked about their annual profit reports, that they were able to increase prices tremendously, and the consumers weren't going to punish them for it because they accepted the story that it was because they were facing higher costs. So for a wide variety of reasons, we had a lot of price pressure on the supply side. Now, it is true that we got trillions of dollars of relief checks. And some people said, oh, this is MMT policy. And in the beginning, it was celebrated. They said, oh, MMT found a new way to spend. You just print money and spend it. Of course, it wasn't MMT. And the relief checks actually was not MMT policy. We opposed it. Yeva and I wrote against it, said this is not a good idea. We should target the spending to where it will do good. Okay, yes, people who lost their jobs, who are in danger of losing their homes, we need to send them relief checks. We need to ramp up spending to deal with the pandemic. So we should have increased spending, but it should have been targeted to the right areas. We shouldn't have sent checks to everyone. That made no sense whatsoever. It was said to be a stimulus, but we didn't need stimulus. The supply chains were all messed up. You don't need a stimulus when supply is down. What you need is relief. So we supported relief, but not sending checks to everyone to supposedly stimulate the economy. Now, in truth, and we present all the evidence for this in our paper. In truth, the first round of relief checks were not spent. They were saved and they were used to pay overdue bills. So that was good. No inflation pressure from that. By the second round of relief checks, which is after Biden comes in, then, we had started reopening and people were starting to go back to work. But we still had disruptions. So we started getting spikes and, in very unusual ways. It wasn't a general increase of aggregate demand. Basically, the demand was only for anything that could be delivered to your door. So this is mainly goods, not services. We're a service sector economy. 80% or whatever of our workers are in the service sector. But for the most part, you couldn't buy services because the close contact. And so it was an unusual increase of demand and played some role in increasing price pressures. So by the second round, there was some pressure on prices, very idiosyncratic, used cars, prices boomed, and that added to the inflation rate. Now, the stimulus ran out a long time ago, okay? And people have spent their saving for the most part. And the saving rate is way down. I think it's only 3% now. So people have exhausted their saving. They're not saving anymore. They are spending. And that is because inflation is so high. So of course they're spending a lot because everything costs a lot more. But there's no more relief. There's no more stimulus checks. So the government is not contributing to the inflation. And things are settling down. All those idiosyncratic things, they've settled down. Oil prices have settled down. So where is the inflation coming from now? It's largely housing. It's in rents and in owner-occupied rental equivalents, which is this strange thing. If you own your own house, you don't pay rent. But the BLS imputes a rent to your house and includes that in the CPI. And so if actual rents are going up, renters are a third, homeowners are 2/3. But if the rents are going up, the imputed rents also go up, and that's what drives inflation. And that's what's scaring the heck out of everybody. But it's that. It is food, because food is 70% of the price of food is oil. Basically, you're eating oil. When you eat food in America, you're eating oil because It's grown with oil, okay? And also food is used to make oil, so it competes with oil. And then it's transported and it's processed with oil. And then there's a lag. So the food we're eating today came from the oil of last year, and that is put into the price. So food will lag oil. Eventually, food prices will come down, but it's going to take a while because it takes another growing season. But then we got a war. So we lost 10% of all the wheat in Ukraine. So that also compounds the problem with food. Anyway, it's a long story. If you're really interested, read our piece that goes through all the details. By the way, there is a good piece by Stiglitz put out, I think, by INET that also goes through a lot of these details, reaches the same conclusion. It's largely supply side. And final footnote, you don't fight supply side problems or problems of a shortage of housing by raising interest rates. It makes no sense. It only makes things worse. We need to build more houses. We have a severe housing shortage because we haven't built houses since the global financial crisis. There's a shortage of houses. There's a shortage of rental units. There's an explosion of homeless people. We should keep the interest rate low and build as many houses as we possibly can.
Absolutely. All right. Up next, we've got Amy.
Amy has two related questions about the job guarantee.
I do. Okay. What thoughts do you have on a federal job guarantee being used as a stabilizer for inflation? That's my first question. My second question's a little bit longer. Pavlina points out in her book, The Case for Job Guarantee, quote, in the immediate post-war era, as economies expanded after each recession, the vast majority of the gains went to the bottom 90% of families. The exact opposite has been true of the last four expansions. Since the 1980s, a growing economy primarily grew the incomes of the wealthiest 10% of families. So my question is, are you aware of any political or economic policies that happened around the 1980s that would push this austerity on the working class?
Yeah. The trend starts earlier, attacks on unions, declining unionization rates, but Reagan really ramped that up with the air traffic controllers. And so it's an attack on labor, an attack on labor union. And it is development of Asia, which is not a bad thing, but competition with low wage labor. It is free trade agreements, NAFTA, and so on that also penalize higher paid American workers. And so it is the stagnation of wages since 1974, actually, that has led to the difference. Previously, if you had a recovery, at least some of the gains would have gone toward the bottom, but they don't anymore. Every recovery since 1990 has been a jobless recovery. So the economy recovers, but all the gains go to the top, and we don't create any jobs. So the people who become unemployed in the recession, it takes a very, very long time to recover those jobs that have been lost, and we don't get wage gains. So that's a huge part of the problem. So how does a job guarantee help? Well, first, you eliminate involuntary unemployment. Anyone who wants a job can get a job in the job guarantee program. So in a recession, you don't become unemployed. You move into the job guarantee program. The second way that it stabilizes it, which means you still have some income. The second way it stabilizes is you push up the wages at the bottom. So you ideally, you set the job guarantee wage at a living wage. And that becomes the minimum wage because no private firm can pay less than the job guarantee wage because people walk off the job. So they've got to at least match the living wage paid in the job guarantee program. And then gradually, as the economy's productivity grows, you increase that wage. That keeps upward pressure on wages and makes sure that the gains of productivity go to the working class. Since 1974, if you look at US history, the wages after inflation have grown at the same pace as labor productivity. So workers shared in the growth of productivity. After 1974, they don't. After 1974, wages after inflation don't grow, but labor productivity continues to grow like it always did. And, that just indicates the gains from growing productivity of our labor force don't go to workers. It goes to owners. It goes to the rentier class and to profits. And that's what Pavlina's data shows. That's where it's going, because the top 10% are not getting significant wages for the most part. They're getting income from ownership.
Yeah, when you said that part about productivity rising and then wages rising, I heard a couple capitalists in the audience chuckling. Okay, Virginia, are you ready?
Sure. This is a question from Herb Weissman, who asked us to read it, I believe. Economists often describe money as a store of value. I have a problem with that definition because it does not make sense that something so easily created and destroyed stores value. It seems to me that it measures the value of equity, assets, and liabilities, and can only be a temporary store of value. He puts in inverted quotes, inverted whatever it is. It can only be a temporary store of value at best to enable the transfer of assets to a balance sheet to cancel the liabilities on that sheet, a unit of account. Could you comment on the so-called store of value and unit of account?
Well, as Keynes said, no one outside an insane asylum would hold money as a store of value in the mainstream economic theory. And the reason is because its return is too low. So, if you think about, I had the Venn diagram, and what we want, the things we want to call money is a small circle in there. And it's things like cash, demand deposits, maybe savings deposits we would include in our definition of money. And the thing that those all have in common is the interest rate you earn is very low, and it's zero on cash, and pretty much zero on demand deposits over the last, more than 10 years. It's been about zero. So you don't get a return on it. It's not a good store of value. And I agree that what it's good for is making purchases and paying bills, redeeming yourself, making sure you don't go to prison for evading tax payments. What he argued, I think, is perfectly consistent with what Keynes was arguing. Now, why might you hold cash even though the return is very low? Well, if you think that all the other alternatives are too risky, and that happens when you either fear you're going to move into a financial crisis or you do move into a financial crisis. That's exactly what we saw happen in 2008 when every bank looked at their balance sheet and they said, hold it a second, all of our assets are trash. I wonder if all the other banks look exactly the same as us. And well, they've all been doing the same stuff. I'm sure all their assets are trash too. And so they all tried to sell everything they had in order to get cash. So you get what's called a run to liquidity, when only cash can quell your disquietude, as Keynes said. Only cash makes you feel secure. Nothing else is liquid other than cash as you move into a financial crisis. That would be the only time it makes sense to hold money as a store of value, when everything else is probably going to be a loser.
Indeed. All right. Our next question is from Jeffrey Wakefield. He says, what do you think about postal banking, and what positive things do you think it will do for the layman?
Yeah, postal savings banks are great. We had them. I think we got rid of them in the mid-60s. So the idea is that you can have an account at the post office, and you can receive your paychecks there, and you can make payments out of your account. Today, it can all be electronic. When the biggest bank in the world, at least a decade ago, was the Japanese Postal Savings Bank. That was the biggest bank in the world. So they still had theirs. I lived in Italy in the mid-'80s, and everybody had an account at their post office, and they paid all their utility bills and all that stuff using their TV remote. They could pay all their bills through their postal savings account. Okay, now why is this a good thing? Well, the post office, first, doesn't have to be for profit. Second, it can be very carefully regulated to make sure it is serving a public interest, which I think the post office always did, at least until President Trump, when he tried to destroy it. It's used to fulfilling a public function and allowing people to have free checking accounts and to have decent interest payments on their savings, which can be determined by Congress. What is a decent rate? Well, let's pay everybody 6% on their savings account, no matter how big it is. Allow them to have a savings account at the post office, with policy determining what the right interest rate should be, rather than for-profit decision-making by private banks. And we wouldn't have the kinds of scandals we have with Crocker creating fake bank accounts in people's names in order to get rewards. So anyway, I think there's lots of advantages, and of course we should do it. Well, I don't know what the number is now, but back in the early 90s, about 25% of Americans were unbanked. They did not have bank accounts because they were too expensive. And so they had to rely on check cashing outlets that charged tremendous fees for payment services. And then when they needed a loan, they didn't have a bank to get a loan from. They had to use pawn shops, which have outrageous interests on the loans that are made, paycheck loans and so on too. So it's a great alternative to those, especially for low-income people. And you don't have to necessarily get rid of private banks. We had private banks when we had a postal savings bank. It's just a supplement that people can use if they prefer to do it.
Yes, indeed. I think that's one of the things I really derive from MMT, is that I think we're indoctrinated with this idea that the private sector always does everything better. And I believe MMT shows us that, well, we don't have to pay CEOs and shareholders, and we can, really focus on the program or whatever, instead of wasting a lot of the resources. But it's neither here nor there. Our next question is from a comrade of mine, Dr. Jackie Lee. And a little side note, she's writing a thesis for her PhD or something, and she came to me asking about MMT and she wanted to learn about it. And to her credit, man, she really dove down the rabbit hole and I'm super proud of her. But here's her question. If the value of money is intrinsically tied to people's trust in its strength and the strength of the US dollar as currency hegemon is being challenged by a growing BRICS and their aims to back the BRICS currency with commodities, how does MMT reconcile with a weakening global demand for investment in the dollar and as a result, a weakened US economy?
Well, the value of the dollar is not determined by trust. We don't accept P.T. Barnum, a sucker born every minute explanation for the value of the dollar. The value of the dollar is determined by, what you have to do to get hold of dollars to pay your tax bill. So ultimately, it's similar to a labor theory of value of Marx. So, for the most part, most of us have to work in order to earn dollars. And on the margin, what we have to do to get a dollar is going to determine the value of the dollar. Now, this is domestically. Foreigners don't have to pay U.S. taxes. I mean, the exporters might have to. But, domestically, we have to get hold of dollars. Foreigners don't necessarily have to get hold of dollars. Come back to the idea that we issue the international reserve currency, which plays some role. So it doesn't necessarily determine the value of the dollar against other currencies. Okay, that is very complexly determined. And most dollars, probably above 99% of dollars external to the United States, are used not to buy goods and services, not to finance trade in goods and services. They are used to purchase assets. So the exchange rate is mostly determined by the external demand to get a hold of dollars to buy financial assets. That's the main thing determining the external value of the currency relative to other currencies. Now, the US issues the main international reserve currency. There are other reserve currencies, British, the euro, the yen, increasingly the RMB, even the Australian dollar are international reserve currencies, but the US is the dominant one right now. I expect it will remain dominant for quite a while. The British pound used to be the dominant international reserve currency. It remained dominant long after the US surpassed it in terms of size of our economy and importance in producing stuff. And I think the dollar will survive as the international reserve currency long after China surpasses us, which arguably they may already have done. And the reason is because there is trust in our legal system. There's trust that contracts that are written to be enforceable in the United States will give foreigners a fair hearing. And finally, there's trust that when the global financial system collapses, the Fed will come to the rescue. And that was verified in the global financial crisis. I said that the Fed spent and lent 29 trillion, about 40% of that was outside the United States. It was to save the rest of the world. The Fed saw that as its responsibility. It's the international reserve currency. A crisis led to a run into the dollar, even though the crisis began in the United States. Okay, it was a United States crisis that then spread around the world, and everyone ran into the dollar, not out of the dollar. And then the Fed bailed them out. Okay, and that greatly increases the external trust for the US dollar. And the reason why I think China won't replace us anytime soon is because I haven't met anyone yet in financial markets who believes that the Central Bank of China would rescue them, or that they would be treated as fairly in court. Eventually, I think it will happen. I think China is moving in that direction, but it has a long ways to go. Some people say the euro, the problem with the euro is that euro land is not an importer. The United States is an importer. The good thing about being an importer from the perspective of the rest of the world is it's relatively easy to get dollars. How do you get dollars? You sell stuff to Americans, and Americans are willing to buy them. Europe, the powerful country, Germany, wants to be an exporter. It's very hard to get a hold of euros. And so you can build up dollar reserves much easier than you can build up euro reserves. So I don't see the euro as being a competitor. Britain already had their day. They are now a relatively small country with a huge financial center, of course, but they're not a competitor. And Japan, maybe we did think they would be a competitor back in the 80s, but after 30 years of relative stagnation, I don't think they're a competitor either. So I do think that the dollar will lose its status as international reserve currency. I think that is a long time in the future. The dollar will continue to go up and down like it has done since Nixon went off gold. Maybe it's going to go down a bit in the near future, and then it's going to go up. It will fluctuate as we have a floating currency, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Virginia, I think you have a question, right?
Yes, we're winding down now. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but come to book club. So I just want to ask this, and then John has one other question to read, and then we're going to have a very brief discussion of book club. I'm looking for volunteers to offer to do chapter summaries. So that's just a heads up. But here's a question from one of the anonymous attendees. Curious to know what everyone's new favorite insight was in this webinar. This could help pick highlights to promote later when this is produced for public consumption. I also think it would be helpful for our writers, for our content producers, to know what people found the most interesting, what their favorite insights were. So please put that in if you have an answer. Okay, John, you want to read Bijou's question?
Yep. Where does Randy think the most effort from headline MMTers and activists should be focused so we do not end up preaching to the choir? On the broad demos, the electorate, or on the people holding the levers of power, or a mix of both, and why?
I wouldn't narrow it to the electorate, but I would say, yes, the general population is the most important. Politicians are not leaders, they're followers. There are a few exceptions, okay, Bernie Sanders, AOC, but they are very afraid to get out in front of the population. For 25 years, we've been meeting with politicians, and many, many times they'll tell us, I understand what you're saying. I agree with you. Yes, we need a job guarantee, or yes, I understand we can't run out of money, but I can never say that in public. That's the biggest problem. It's only when they feel comfortable, that their constituents accept it, that they will say it in public. So I think that's the most important thing. It doesn't do any good to get politicians on board unless they're very unusual people, because they face an election. And I'm not being, I think, overly critical, because it's a political reality. You got to get reelected. So we need to get to the population. And so the first breakthrough we had was blogs. So Billy blog and Stephanie's New Economic Perspectives got the ideas out to the public. And then our textbook that was mentioned was a way to get it into the classroom. I don't tweet, whatever it is, tweet. I don't do that, but I guess that helped. But anyway, I think that's what needs to be done.
I couldn't agree more. All right. Well, this is the point in the program where we thank Dr. Wray for his time and everything you do, man. Keep it up. We're making a difference slowly but surely.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity.
Randy, thank you so much. We'll see you in a month or so when you come and answer everybody's questions. But this was so helpful.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks, buddy.
So again, I want to apologize that we didn't get to everyone's questions. They were really good questions tonight. And we always try to get a wide range. And so, hey, we do our best. Okay, two things I want from you guys. One is to let us know what your favorite insights were, which was that question somebody asked. And sort of which elements you think are the most important or exciting to keep pushing out into the world. Secondly, I really want people to volunteer to do short chapter summaries for book club. And, just like a little 5-minute, 3-minute, whatever, talk about what the chapter said. The schedule is actually in the Zoom registration link, but it'll be chapters 1 and 2, then 3, 4, 5, and then 6 and 7. So that's how they're grouped. You can either do one chapter or whichever, other chapters are going to be discussed that week. But it would really be cool. It would be so great if it's not just John and me up here running the thing. We would love to have other people participating. So, yes, Cheryl, it would be speaking. It would be just like giving a little presentation, like a mini presentation.
Book report or something.
Like a little book report, exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. And sort of just some key points from that particular chapter. You can, reach out on Facebook or Twitter, or if you're in teams with Real Progressives, you can reach out to me, or somebody from our group reach out to Rob Baxter or Mark Fabian. They are always around. You can always find them on social media. And let us know that you'd like to help with that. Excellent.
Yeah, man. I think John Bloomfield just commented the Q&A section was the most thought-provoking. That's the coolest thing about our book clubs, man, is we have the experts coming in here and answering the questions, and they do a great job.
Thank you. Jeffrey is still drinking coffee from his RP Book Club mug. So everybody should go to realprogressives.org, go to the merch section and buy a damn book club mug or t-shirt or whatever we have. We also always need donations. We need monthly supporters on Patreon. What is it? Patreon.com/realprogressives or vice versa. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. And remember to head over to the website, realprogressives.org. All kinds of cool resources and stuff, especially if you're having some discourse online or whatever, you need some reference material. There's some great stuff there. And every week, Saturday morning is the flagship podcast, Macro and Cheese. It's so awesome. It covers so much. That's right.
And everything that was discussed tonight can be found somewhere on Macro and Cheese. You just have to listen to 206 episodes or something.
It'll only take you 3 or 4 minutes.
But worth it, man. Such good stuff in there.
Great. There.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
All right,
Rob.
guys. Adios.
Bye-bye.